Aseprite is not only a great tool for creating standalone pixel art images or sprite assets for your game project, it also allows you to create tile sets and test them directly in Aseprite by mapping out your game level ideas. If you're just starting out on your pixel art game dev journey, or you've been using other software for creating your tile maps and you're curious to see how it can be done in Aseprite, let's go through the process together. We will be focusing on square side view tiles, but the same principles apply to square top-down tiles too. Square tiles in general are best suited for Aseprite's tilemap features. You can create isometric tiles in Aseprite too, but in its current version 1.3.15, it has less natively built-in features to support that compared to other software such as Tiled. If isometric tiles are what you're looking for, you can watch my video on the fundamentals of isometric pixel art, which I have linked in the description below. A good approach to start creating a new tile map from scratch is to make one tile first and then expand from there by modifying it. To make our first tile, we create a new scene with a desired resolution. A popular tile size for pixel art is 16 by 16 pixels, so let's go for that. Now that we have our little canvas here, we can start drawing. We will make a side view dirt or ground tile, which can be used for platformers or other side-scrolling games. We start with one brown base color and one darker shade of that color. To have some rocks in our ground tile, we can also add one gray and a lighter tint of that gray color. The first thing we want to do before we draw our first pixels is to make sure that our tile connects seamlessly in either X, Y, or both directions. Our first tile will be a base terrain tile from which we can later derive upper, lower, left or right surface tiles. So for this one we want to make it tile seamlessly in both the X and the Y axes. In order to do that, we go up here in the menu to View and then Tiled mode, and then select Tiled in both axes. This will change our canvas so that we now get a 3x3 grid of our original canvas. So essentially we see our tile now 9 times, and when we draw over one of its edges, it automatically wraps around and we continue drawing on the opposite end of the tile. This way we know for sure that our tile seamlessly connects to itself as a left, right, top or bottom neighbor when we use it in a game level. Now we can start by filling the entire canvas with our lighter brown base color. Then we switch to our darker gray in our palette, create a new layer and start drawing in some details such as underground rocks or pebbles. Imagine this tile as a 2D cross-section of the ground or soil in your game world. Make sure that the shapes are not too similar to each other and create a good mix of smaller and bigger rocks. Don't hesitate to go back and forth with the brush and the eraser tool a few times until you are happy with the general structure. Once you are, you can merge the two layers back into one. Now we can add some shading. To do that, we select the two brown color tones and switch from simple ink to shading mode like this. Because we have only selected the brown colors, we can safely paint over our tile in this mode without affecting the gray shapes. With that setup, we can now create some dark edges on one side of the rock shapes. Imagine the light coming in from the opposite direction and the rock standing out a little from the soil and casting a small shadow. Of course, this is not really physically accurate since we are looking at a slice of an underground structure which anyways wouldn't receive any light, but it does give our tiles some more depth and makes it more pleasant to look at. In the same way, we can also add some highlighting to our rocks. We select the two gray tones and while still in shading mode, we can reverse the shade by clicking here or pressing X on the keyboard. This means that we can now lighten up our gray color without affecting any of the brown tones in our tile. This way we can give the rock some highlighting on the side that is opposite of the shadows we just created. At this point, feel free to experiment with more or less stones, including shading and highlighting, because it will determine the overall look of our first tile. In my case here, I felt that less of those stone structures looked better, so I removed some, shifted the remaining ones around and changed up the shapes where I saw fit. Depending on what type of soil you make, You can now also add some more details with a new color. For example, some green underground plant or root structures that grow between the rocks. For that, add one darker and one lighter green to your palette and draw those details in. Give it some finishing touches, then switch off tiled mode again from the view menu, and here we have our first ground tile. And now we can set up an actual tile map with it and start creating variations of our tile from there. We create a new scene for our tile map. The tile we just made is 16 by 16 pixels, so let's pick a canvas size that can hold enough of them to map out some game level ideas. For example, 320 by 240 pixels. Those are multiples of 16, so no tiles are cut off in our canvas, but you could of course pick any other resolution if you want. I like our background to be black in this case, and the color mode to not be indexed but RGBA for now. This is not strictly necessary, but we will get back to that in a bit. One useful feature in Aseprite when drawing our tile maps is the grid. You can go to View, Grid, and then Grid Settings and configure how large your grid cell should be and if there should be any offset in X or Y. My settings here are already good. Our grid cells should be 16 by 16 pixels to hold exactly one tile each, and the grid should have no offset. To actually show and hide the grid in the canvas, go to View, Show, Grid, or press Ctrl and the single quotation mark on your keyboard. And now we can switch to our ground tile in the other tab again. Press M, click and drag to select everything, press Ctrl C to copy, switch back to our new scene, create a new layer on top of the background layer, and press Ctrl V to paste in the tile. This step is the reason why I set the color mode to RGBA in the beginning. Because in indexed mode, copy-pasting our tile into the new scene would result in some color changes, because our new scene has a different palette, and our tile would automatically take the colors from that palette at the corresponding indices. In RGBA modes, the colors of the tile will stay intact, and we can now go to the palette settings and click New Palette from Sprite to replace the current palette with the colors that we are using in our tile originally. There are other ways to achieve the same result if you like to be in index mode the entire time, but I think it is useful to understand why you might see wrong colors when copy-pasting something from another image, so doing this step in RGBA mode is one way to avoid that. And now comes the fun part. The new layer we created, which contains our tile, can be turned into a tile map layer. To do that, we right-click the layer, select Convert to, and then Tile Map. You can also create new tile map layers directly from the New option, but let's convert the one that we already have. This brings up this dialog, in which we can give our tile map a name and configure the width and height of the tiles, which we of course set again to 16 pixels each. There are some advanced options, which we will get back to in a bit. For now you can leave them as is. You can see now that Aseprite has created a new area in the side menu below our palette. Similar to the color palette, it shows our palette of tiles, and we can now draw with those tiles in our canvas. Tiles in our canvas are managed similarly to how colors are managed in index color mode. Each tile in your palette gets assigned an index number, and the tiles drawn in your canvas are linked to those numbers. When you press and hold the Ctrl key on your keyboard, you can see which grid cell in your canvas holds which tile index. Up here in the top left, we have some buttons for modifying our tile map. The first one toggles between drawing tiles and drawing colors, and you can also use space and tab on your keyboard to switch back and forth. Right-clicking that button will stop showing both the palette and the tile areas at the same time, but you can still use space tab to toggle between the two. The other three buttons next to it are three different tile editing modes: Manual, Auto, and Stack mode. Use manual mode when you want to modify all tiles of a specific index in your canvas at once. Use auto mode when you want to draw new tiles or keep modifying the tile under your mouse cursor while not changing any of the other tiles. And use stack mode when you want to draw new tiles or make several changes to an already existing tile, where each change will be stored as a new separate tile in your palette. This is just a general rule of thumb on how to use those modes though, and in the beginning their behavior might sometimes be a bit confusing and not match exactly with what you intended to do. So let's have a closer look at what each of those modes does exactly, to get a better understanding of what they do to your tile palette. When you select manual mode and you start painting with a color over a tile in your canvas, those changes will be applied not only to that one instance of the tile you're drawing over, but to all instances of the tile in your image. And you can also see that changed tile in your tile palette. This is indeed very useful when you want to modify all tiles of a specific type in your image at once, and you don't need to keep the previous version of that tile in your palette. Note that you cannot draw anything in empty space in this mode, because it is only for modifying existing tiles. This mode is called manual because there's no automatic behavior in place. No matter what you do in this mode, Aseprite will not automatically add or remove tiles in your palette. Instead, it gives you full manual control over the appearance of all instances of the tiles you are modifying. And this is one key difference to the other two editing modes, because both auto mode and stack mode might automatically update your tile palette, depending on what you're doing. In auto mode, the moment you stop drawing something, Aseprite will compare what is now in your canvas with the tiles in your palette. If at that moment you have drawn something that is not already in your tile palette, it will add this new content as new tiles to your palette. If, on the other hand, you have a tile in your palette that is now no longer used anywhere in your canvas, it will automatically remove that unused tile from the palette. When we hold the Control key, we indeed see that Aseprite has now created a new tile of index 2, and this one is now located in the spot where we were drawing, while the rest of the tiles in the scene are still index 1 tiles. If we add our new tile number 2 another time to our image and then we draw over it in auto mode, we get another tile number 3, because that is new content. And we also still have tile number 2 because it is still used in our canvas over here. A particular situation which we can use to our advantage for our workflow is when we use a specific tile only once in our canvas. For example, our new tile number 3 here. If we now draw over this tile again, it seems as if we are directly modifying tile 3. But this is actually not exactly what's happening here. What happens is that Aseprite detects that what we have just drawn is different to our tile number 3, so it adds that as a new tile with index 4. But since we now no longer have tile 3 anywhere used in our canvas, Aseprite automatically removes tile number 3 and our new tile number 4 becomes number 3 again. This is why it looks like we were simply modifying tile number 3 in this situation. And this is actually quite useful for us because often you might just want to keep modifying a specific tile without creating all those in-between changes you make as new tiles. But sometimes you might actually want that, and this is where the third mode comes into play. The third mode, called stack mode, also compares what you have in your canvas with the current tile palette, and whenever there is something new that is not already in your tile palette, it will add it as a new tile. Contrary to auto mode, however, it does never delete any tiles from your palette. So whenever you make a change to any tile in the canvas that results in something new, it will add this new tile to your palette. When you modify a tile into something that actually already exists as a tile in your palette, it will just update the index information accordingly. So stack mode does not create any duplicates in your tile palette. In fact, none of the three modes ever create any duplicate tiles in your tile palette, so you will always have a list of unique tiles there. Now that we know the different tile editing modes, we can start using them to create different variations of our ground tile. Since this is a typical side view tile as they are used in, for example, platformer games, let's create some surface tiles to give the player some visual clue on where they can stand or run, and to also expand the game world by adding a first biome. We could use this ground tile for several biomes by just adding different surfaces to it, for example ice, sand or grass. Since we already have some green tones in our color palette, let's add some grass. So from what we have just learned, which editing mode should we pick? Well, not the first one, because we don't want to override our ground tile with grass surface everywhere in our image. We could pick the third mode because then we get a new tile added to our palette, but then every time we modify something in that tile again, we'd get all those modifications as separate tiles too. So that's not useful either when we want to create a new tile variant and keep working on it for a while. So auto mode it is. We just add some green grass to the top of our ground tile like this. And then we can go one step further and add some grass on top of the tile itself. This area here is not part of our surface tile below anymore. So Auto Mode will add this as a third tile to our palette, with only the grass surface and the rest of the tile transparent. You could decide to make the surface and the grass on top part of the same tile by just lowering the walking plane a bit inside the tile, because then you could easily insert the combination of both with just one click to your game level. However, it is good practice to keep those two parts as separate tiles, because it gives you more flexibility on how to combine things later. You could, for example, have different versions of the grass on top or add other plants and vegetation without having duplicate visuals below them in your tile palette. Another advantage is that you can play with layering more easily. In your game engine, with a player character standing on the collider that defines the ground, you could have most of the surface grass rendered behind the character, but decide to occasionally have some of it rendered in front of the character to give your game world a bit more depth. By keeping the surface grass separate from the ground tiles, you can do that without having to render any attached ground tiles in front of the character too, which makes it easier to manage your tile layers consistently. Now we can place the new grass tiles in our surfaces in our example scene. The next thing that we can do is to make our platforms look less blocky. In general, you need to decide how much you want to disguise those grid patterns for your game. If the grid is noticeable, it fits games that have abstract graphics or environments that are more hard, sterile and manufactured looking, rather than soft, natural and flowy. Since we are creating something with grass and nature in our example, let's therefore soften up those platform side edges a bit. We will keep using Auto Mode for this. In fact, Auto Mode will probably be the mode that you end up using the most during the initial tile creation process. The more natural we want the world to appear, the more variations of the same type of tile we can add to our palette. So let's keep going and create a second variant of this side edge too. And a third. And now we should do the same for the other side. But hold on a second here. Don't just start modifying the edge tiles on the other side. Of course you could do that to create even more variants, but this is a good moment to talk about another useful feature of Aseprite's tilemap: flipping and rotating tiles. With a tile selected to draw in your canvas, you can press space and R on your keyboard to rotate the tile in steps of 90 degrees. If you press space and X, then you can flip the tile in X direction, which means flip it left or right. Or, for the math people among us, mirror it along the Y-axis. If you press space and Y, you can flip it in Y direction, so up and down. And if you press space and D, you can mirror it along its diagonal that runs from the top left to the bottom right. So instead of drawing new tile modifications on the other side of our floating platform, we can simply flip our tiles with space X and place them on the other side. If you now press and hold Ctrl to show the tile indices, you will see that Aseprite now indicates not only the tile index, but also the type of transformation that has been applied to this particular tile. So since we flip this tile in X direction, we see an X below that index number. If we flip the tile now in Y direction, it will indicate that as XY, and if we take this result again and flip it along the diagonal, it will show XYD. So now you might expect that you see also an R when you rotate the tile, but this is not the case. Displaying an R for the tile being rotated would actually not say much, because it could have been rotated multiple times and from different initial states. So that information alone wouldn't tell us much. But the result of a rotation can always be achieved by a combination of flipping in X, Y or diagonal direction. So Aseprite will show a combination of those transformations instead. And those are always relative to the tile in its original state. Remember those advanced options when we started creating our tilemap layer? You can bring this dialog up again for our existing tilemap too by going to the layer properties or press F2 and then click this little tilemap icon over here. The advanced options include 3 buttons labeled Allowed Flips, one for X, one for Y and one for D. With those buttons, you can configure if Aseprite should automatically reuse already existing tiles in your palette in case you just created a flipped version of a tile that already exists. If we, for example, switch off allowed flips for X and we have a tile like this, and we then create a second version of that tile that happens to be the original version but flipped in X direction, Aseprite will just keep that new version as a new tile. But if we switch on allowed flips for X, creating the same situation would trigger Aseprite to automatically detect that the new tile is actually our previous tile but just flipped in X direction. So instead of keeping it as a new tile, it will replace it with the original but flipped. And the same concept holds for the X and D flips. The advanced option base index is simply the number from which Aseprite should start counting the tiles in your tile palette. Now we have some tiles next to rotated versions of our tiles, and this might sometimes give us unwanted artifacts like over here. This is because we created them to tile well with all tiles in their initial state, but not necessarily when rotated or flipped. But don't see this as a problem, but rather as a good opportunity to create some more variance by directly breaking those unwanted patterns. So let's do that and change those tiles up a bit. And when we are done with this step, we can place those new variants in our ground tile in more parts of our example scene. You might in the end even keep some of those artifacts, because in the bigger context they might actually look interesting. But this is an artistic choice again. Now the last remaining step to make our tiles look less blocky is changing up the lower edges for those floating platforms too. Feel free to add more detail, such as some roots sticking out here and there. Whenever you are happy with your tilemap and you want to use it outside of Aseprite and test it in your game, you can export it by going to File, Export, and then Export Tileset. One limitation of Aseprite's tilemap feature is that you cannot have regular drawing layers when you are creating or editing your tiles, but I found a little workaround for that. Instead of separate regular layers, you can create separate tilemap layers and use them to draw different parts of your tiles. For example, your ground in layer 1 and the grass surface in layer 2 on top of that. And once you are happy with the result and you want this to become one tile again, you can select those layers, right click and click flatten, and then convert that resulting layer again back into a tilemap layer like we did before. By the way, if you struggle with the colors in your tilemap and you feel like the colors are off and you don't really know how to make them look better, have a look at this video next.